The Wendigo by Algernon Blackwood, published in 1910, a Lantern Library retelling. The northern wilderness swallowed sound in a way that felt deliberate. It was never silent, always full of pines breathing, water shifting under ice, winds muttering like they carried memories, but it left men feeling small, as though the land had chosen to ignore them. Into that vastness came 4 men late in autumn: Dr. Cathcart, his nephew Simpson, the seasoned guide Hank Davis, and the cook known only as Punk. They came to hunt moose, and perhaps to taste the thrill of living where civilization ended and legend began. Dr. Cathcart was a man of intellect, respected for his papers on psychology, fear, hallucinations, the odd things that belief can make the mind see. He liked to examine mysteries from a safe distance. Out here, he carried himself with the calm authority of someone who believed no story could truly unnerve him. Simpson, his nephew, was 20 and eager to prove himself. He had the quiet intensity of a young man not yet tested by the world. The sheer size of the country already humbled him, the endless sweep of dark forest and the glittering lakes that made his familiar life feel small. He liked that feeling. Hank Davis, their lead guide, had the kind of competence that didn't need boasting. Compact, weathered, he could read the sky like a clock and carry a canoe as though it were a feather. He spoke little, but when he repeated himself, you listened. And then there was Punk, their cook, whose quiet efficiency made the camp seem to run on its own. He rarely gave opinions, but his watchfulness was sharpest at night when the forest's murmurs deepened. He had lived in these woods long enough to know they deserved respect. They traveled by canoe and portage, stitching together rivers, lakes, and the long grinds of rock between. Their gear was simple: rifles, packs, canvas tent, blankets lined with spruce boughs, tins of food. Nights were sharp with frost, mornings crisp as glass. No village lay within 100 miles, only the trails of animals and the shifting paths of the wind. The camp they chose was good, a windbreak of firs, flat ground for the tent, stones for a fire ring. At night, the lake beside them reflected the stars so perfectly it seemed like a second sky. The first evening passed with little talk. They ate, smoked, and listened to the forest lower its voice as though settling for the night. It was then they were joined by a 5th man, Défago, a French-Canadian guide hired for his knowledge of country even deeper than Hank's. Lean and quick, his laughter flickered like sparks and vanished as if his ears were tuned for something beyond the group. His soft accent and light step seemed born of the forest. When he shook Simpson's hand, it felt like a welcome and a warning at once. Punk watched Défago's arrival in silence, returning to his fire with a tight expression. Later, when the meal was done and the stars burned hard above them, Punk murmured something to Hank in a voice too low for Simpson to catch. Hank's reply ended the talk, but the flicker of unease remained. Tomorrow, the plan was to split. Hank and Dr. Cathcart would take the eastern ridge, while Défago and Simpson explored the western flats. The guides had seen fresh signs of moose, and splitting their efforts promised better luck. "First light," Hank said, his tone final. That night, Simpson lay awake long after the others had settled. The tent walls bellied with the cold wind, the forest breathing just beyond. He wasn't afraid, more alert, as though waiting for something unnamed. Before he drifted to sleep, he heard his uncle stamp out his pipe outside and return, the professor's presence steady and sure. At dawn, the air cut like a blade. Frost silvered the spruce boughs and their breath hung white. They worked in silence, striking the fire, boiling water, eating quickly. Défago already had his pack shouldered. Punk's eyes followed Simpson once, then lowered, unreadable. "West Flats," Défago said with brisk friendliness. "We make a loop." "Light feet, eh?" Simpson nodded, nerves and excitement mingling. Hank sketched the map on a piece of birch bark. Stream here, tamarack stand there, swamp edge where moose might feed. Dr. Cathcart's hand on Simpson's shoulder pressed confidence into him. Trust your guide. Keep your head. Pay attention. They set off as the sun lifted, pale and cold over the tree line. The forest swallowed them without sound, closing behind like a door. Simpson felt again the sensation he'd known since arriving, that he was a guest here, weighed and measured by the silence. Back at camp, Punk fed a small flame into a larger one and glanced toward the west, where the flats stretched in a maze of swamp and mirrored pools. He rubbed his hands, though he wasn't cold, and tilted his head as though listening for something no one else could hear. The western flats stretched out like a puzzle of forest and swamp, a place where ground turned treacherous and the trees grew thin in patches. By mid-morning, Simpson had already learned to admire the way Défago moved. The guide slipped between undergrowth like water pouring over stones. Quiet, sure-footed, eyes never still. "You listen close," Défago said once, pausing to study a patch of ground. "The forest speaks different here. Not just moose or bear, other things." Simpson asked what he meant, but Défago only smiled faintly, lifting a broken branch to show fresh moose sign. The answer slipped away like the sound of the wind. Back at camp, the unease had grown heavier. Punk moved about with more silence than usual, glancing often at the western line of trees. When Dr. Cathcart asked him what was wrong, the cook hesitated, then muttered something about the old stories and that country yonder. "What stories?" the professor pressed, tone sharp with curiosity. But Punk only shook his head, eyes dropping. "Best not to speak of them. Better still not to go there." Cathcart's eyebrows rose. He had written entire lectures on the way superstition grows in isolated places, yet something in Punk's quiet finality gave him pause. He let the matter rest, though he made a mental note to revisit it with Hank later. Hank himself looked troubled when Punk's words reached him. That evening, after Simpson and Défago returned from their scouting loop, the two guides spoke together in low tones. Simpson, busy with the fire, caught only a few fragments. "Smell on the wind. Tracks too long. Don't tell the boy." Défago waved it off when questioned, but his laugh was a shade too quick. "Old talk, that's all. Stories to keep children close to camp." Yet as night settled, the mood of the camp shifted. Even Dr. Cathcart, pipe in hand, felt it in the way the firelight stretched too far into the trees and the wind hushed suddenly, like someone holding their breath. It was Hank who finally broke the silence. "You ever hear of the Wendigo?" he asked, voice low, eyes on the fire. The words seemed to hang there, heavy, as though it didn't belong in the open air. Punk, crouched at the fire's edge, stiffened and turned away. Simpson shook his head. The professor gave a short laugh, a touch too brisk. "A forest bogeyman, I suppose?" Hank nodded slowly. "That's one name. Some say it's a spirit of the north. Wind and hunger and the loneliness of the wild, all bound into one. It takes men who wander too far. They say its feet burn the moss, its breath stinks of death, and if it calls your name, you're lost." Défago's eyes flicked up at that, sharp for a moment before softening again. "Talk for the fireside," he said lightly, though he didn't meet Hank's gaze. Punk rose abruptly, muttering something about the night being bad for such words. He moved to the tent, shoulders hunched, as though even hearing the name had set him on edge. Dr. Cathcart, seizing the chance to lecture, waved a dismissive hand. "Hallucination, gentlemen. Fear of the dark made flesh in the mind. Out here, with this silence and these shadows, the imagination runs wild. The Wendigo is a convenient shape for that fear." Simpson nodded, though he felt a chill that reason couldn't quite explain. He told himself it was only the night air slipping down his collar. Still, the camp seemed different after that. The forest loomed closer. The wind sounded almost like a voice at times, rising, falling, carrying hints of syllables too faint to catch. Even Hank kept glancing into the trees, his jaw set. Later, as they settled into their blankets, Simpson overheard a murmur from Défago's corner of the tent, too soft to catch. A prayer, perhaps, or a charm. When Simpson shifted, Défago turned on his side and pulled the blanket tight. The night pressed long and uneasy. Once, a sound drifted across the camp, a cry, high and thin, so far away it could have been the wind bending through the pines. Punk stirred and muttered in his sleep. Hank rose, stepped out, and stood for several minutes in the cold air, staring west. He came back with his face hard, saying nothing. By morning, nothing had changed in the practical sense. The fire was lit, water boiled, rifles cleaned. Yet a tension hung over the group like a low mist. Punk's silence deepened. He would not meet Défago's eyes. Hank kept his movements sharp and economical, avoiding talk. Dr. Cathcart tried to pierce the mood with reason. "We are here to hunt moose, not shadows," he declared, puffing smoke from his pipe. "Let's not indulge old wives' tales." No one argued, but no one laughed either. When the time came to split again, Hank drew Dr. Cathcart aside. His words were quiet, but Simpson caught one phrase: "Keep your ears open tonight." Défago clapped Simpson on the shoulder, cheerful on the surface. "Ready for a real trail, eh?" he said. But behind the brightness in his voice was something else, something that made Simpson's stomach tighten. They set out toward the western flats once more, the land falling into bog and stunted timber. The ground trembled underfoot with hidden water. A smell hung in the air, sharp and unfamiliar, as though the wind had shifted from some far-off place. Simpson told himself it was nothing, just the musk of swamp, the rot of fallen wood. But when he glanced at Défago, he found the guide pausing, nose lifted, face drawn tight. Défago spat into the moss and muttered in French, too low for Simpson to catch. Then, forcing a grin, he motioned onward. "Come, moose wait for no man." The forest closed behind them once again, but this time Simpson felt less like a guest and more like prey, walking deeper into someone else's domain. By the second day on the western flats, Simpson had grown used to the rhythm of wilderness travel, long trudges over half-frozen bog, rifle balanced across his shoulders, pack shifting against his back. Défago led with tireless energy, guiding them through tangles of spruce and across stretches where the moss sank beneath their boots like a wet sponge. Yet there was something different in the guide's manner. He was quieter now, his eyes searching the tree line more often than the ground. Twice he paused, sniffing the air like a hound. The second time, he gave a low whistle and shook his head. "What is it?" Simpson asked, forcing a steady tone. "Wind strange, that's all," Défago answered quickly. He spat into the moss again, muttered a French word Simpson didn't know, and pushed on. They set camp at dusk in a hollow of firs. The ground was damp, but they built a bed of spruce boughs and lit a fire whose smoke drifted pale through the branches. Supper was simple: hardtack, tea, a strip of bacon fried in its own grease. The warmth felt good after the damp slog. But Défago remained restless. He circled the clearing as they ate, pausing often to listen. Once, he bent over a patch of ground at the edge of the firelight and studied it too long for Simpson's liking. "What do you see?" Simpson asked. "Tracks," Défago muttered, and then shook his head as if he regretted speaking. "Moose, maybe?" Hard to tell in this ground, he threw the last of his tea into the fire and crouched close, shoulders hunched. The night pressed in quickly. The forest around them seemed to draw closer once the fire crackled low. Simpson lay in his blanket listening to the endless whisper of wind through branches. Every so often, a sharper note rose above it, like a cry, thin and far, that might have been the trees creaking or might have been something else. At some point, he realized Défago was still awake, sitting upright, staring into the darkness. His face was tense, eyes wide and glistening in the firelight. Simpson stirred, meaning to speak, but Défago pressed a finger to his lips. "Listen," the guide whispered. At first, Simpson heard nothing beyond the usual breathing of the forest. Then it came, a faint sound, high and mournful, riding the wind. It lasted only a second, then was gone, leaving the pines swaying in uneasy silence. "What was it?" Simpson asked, throat dry. Défago shivered. "The wind," he said. But his voice lacked conviction. He added something in French, almost like a prayer, and lay down without another word. Sleep came fitfully to Simpson. He dreamed of vast shadows moving across the treetops, of voices calling names he almost recognized. When he woke in the gray before dawn, he found Défago already crouched by the fire, eyes bloodshot, hands steadying a kettle, though the water inside had not yet boiled. They ate little that morning, then pushed deeper into the flats. The ground grew trickier, broken by pools of dark water edged with tamarack. Birds were scarce. Once, they came across a set of tracks in the mud. Long, narrow impressions that stretched farther than any human stride. Simpson crouched to study them. "Moose?" he asked, though his voice faltered. Défago shook his head sharply. "Not moose." He stood quickly, motioning to move on. "Best keep walking." All through that day, the guide's unease sharpened. He would pause mid-step, tilt his head, sniff the air. At times, Simpson thought he caught a whiff too, an odor faint but foul, sharp like something burnt mixed with decay. Each time, Défago muttered angrily under his breath and pushed the pace harder. By late afternoon, Simpson's legs ached, but Défago showed no sign of slowing. His energy seemed almost feverish, as if he were fleeing rather than hunting. At last, they stopped near a rise of ground where stunted firs offered a poor shelter. The guide dropped his pack with a thud and rubbed his face with both hands. Simpson had never seen him look so drawn. "What is it?" he asked. Défago glanced up, eyes bloodshot and strange. "You smell it, eh?" "That," he broke off, shaking his head. "Nothing. Just swamp rot." But Simpson had smelled it. The reek clung in the air, acrid and unnatural. It made him want to gag. That night, the unease became terror. They lay wrapped in their blankets, the fire a low glow. At first, only the usual rustlings reached them, branches shifting, the sigh of distant water. Then, faint and far, came a cry. It rose and fell like wind in a vast cavern, drawn out, mournful, filled with an anguish that pierced straight through the nerves. Simpson jerked upright, heart hammering. Défago was already on his feet, eyes wide, face gray in the starlight. "Mon Dieu," he whispered, "it's calling." The cry came again, closer this time, and Simpson swore he heard something in it. Syllables, almost words, a shape that tugged at the edges of recognition, as though his own name trembled in the sound. He turned to Défago, but the guide was no longer beside him. Instead, he stood at the clearing's edge, staring west into the darkness. His whole body shook as though caught in a fever. "Défago!" Simpson shouted. "What is it?" The man half turned, face twisted with fear and longing, both. "It calls me," he said hoarsely. "It's the Wendigo." Before Simpson could move, before he could speak again, the guide gave a strangled cry and rushed into the trees. The forest swallowed him in an instant, his footsteps thudding like frantic drums, and then fading, lengthening, until they sounded less like human strides and more like something vast, something impossibly swift, racing across the flats. Simpson stumbled after him to the edge of the clearing, but there was nothing. Only darkness, the whisper of pines, and the lingering echo of that cry still shaking the night. He stood frozen, rifle in hand, the fire guttering low behind him. The wilderness seemed suddenly endless, alive, watching. He was alone, utterly alone, and somewhere out in the blackness, the Wendigo ran with his guide. Simpson stood rooted at the edge of the clearing, the night pressing around him like a weight. Défago's footsteps had thundered away into the dark, each stride impossibly long, until the sound no longer belonged to a man at all. Then there was only silence, the kind of silence that makes the skin crawl. He called the guide's name until his throat was raw, but the forest gave back nothing. Now and then, he thought he caught a faint cry in the distance, high and mournful, like wind tearing through cavernous spaces. Each time it lifted the hair on his neck. Alone, Simpson forced himself back to the fire. He fed it wood with shaking hands, listening for every crack of a branch, every whisper of air. Sleep was impossible. He sat through the endless hours with the rifle across his knees, mind circling around the word Défago had spoken, Wendigo. Toward dawn, exhaustion dragged him into a shallow doze. He woke to a thin light spreading over the flats and a sound that turned his blood to ice. Footsteps approaching. He snatched up the rifle, heart hammering, and listened. The steps were uneven, stumbling, yet swift. Branches snapped, brush rustled. Then a figure lurched into the clearing. It was Défago, yet not the man Simpson had known. His clothes hung in tatters, face ashen, eyes wild. He moved as though torn between collapse and flight, staggering forward, then halting suddenly, head cocked as though listening for something only he could hear. "Défago!" Simpson cried, rushing to him. The guide swayed, lips working soundlessly before a whisper escaped. "My feet! Oh mon Dieu! My feet of fire!" Simpson recoiled. He glanced down and saw nothing unusual, boots caked with mud, frayed at the seams. Yet the way Défago stared at them, the terror in his face, made Simpson's stomach twist. "Sit, rest, you're safe now," Simpson urged, guiding him to the fire. Défago collapsed, trembling violently. His skin burned with fever, sweat pouring down his face despite the freezing air. All that day, Simpson tried to care for him, wrapping him in blankets, feeding him broth, speaking softly. But Défago's condition worsened. He muttered incessantly, half in English, half in French. Words like burning feet and the call and too far, too fast drifted in fragments. At times he shrieked, clutching his boots as though they concealed something monstrous. Simpson fought rising panic. He told himself it was delirium, exposure, perhaps some strange infection of the swamp. Yet the echo of that cry in the night gnawed at him, and the memory of those impossibly long strides. By the second morning, Simpson made a decision. Alone, he could not manage this. He would guide Défago back to camp where Dr. Cathcart and Hank could help. The journey was agonizing. Défago staggered beside him, muttering, sometimes lurching into wild bursts of speed that Simpson struggled to check. Other times he collapsed, sobbing that, "It pulled me, faster, faster, oh, the feet of fire." The worst was when Défago lifted his head suddenly and listened. His eyes widened with a mixture of dread and longing. "It calls again," he whispered. "Don't you hear it? It knows my name." Simpson heard nothing but wind, but his skin crawled. Each time he dragged Défago onward, heart thudding with the fear that if he faltered even a moment, the man would bolt into the trees, chasing that phantom cry. At last, after a day and night of tortured progress, the outline of the camp rose before them. Relief surged through Simpson so strongly his knees nearly buckled. Hank was the first to spot them. He came running, then stopped short as he saw the state of Défago. Dr. Cathcart followed, eyes sharp behind his glasses, while Punk hovered in the background, face pale. Together they carried the guide into the tent. Défago lay shivering, lips moving ceaselessly. The firelight showed his face drawn tight, skin stretched as though by some inner force. "What happened?" Dr. Cathcart demanded, turning to Simpson. Simpson gave the account as best he could. The cry in the night, Défago's sudden flight, his ravings, the strange smell on the wind. He left out none of it, though speaking the words aloud made them sound wild. The professor listened intently, expression grim. When Simpson finished, Cathcart exhaled smoke from his pipe and said, "Hallucination brought on by fatigue and solitude. The wilderness can do strange things to a man's mind." But Hank shook his head, eyes fixed on Défago. "Not all of this is in his head. I've seen the signs before. Once, years back." He lowered his voice. "It's the Wendigo." Punk made a sign against evil and turned away. Dr. Cathcart frowned. "Superstition, you'll infect the boy with it." Yet even he looked troubled as Défago gave a sudden, piercing scream and clutched his feet again, crying about the fire burning through his soles. That night was dreadful. The fever climbed, Défago's ramblings filled the tent, and the others kept vigil by turns. Sometimes he begged to be tied down, fearing he would run again. Sometimes he sobbed that he was already lost, that his soul had been stretched too far for human skin. Once, near midnight, he rose suddenly with a strength that shocked them, tearing free of the blankets. Hank and Simpson wrestled him down while he shrieked words that made no sense, yet in them was the raw terror of a man hunted by something greater than death. At last, near dawn, he collapsed into a fitful sleep. His breathing was shallow, his body burning hot as coals. The three men sat outside the tent in silence, the fire throwing long shadows. Punk would not speak. Hank kept staring into the west, his jaw clenched. Dr. Cathcart puffed his pipe furiously, as if the act alone could drive back the unease. Simpson said nothing. He kept hearing that cry in his memory, the one that had split the night, and wondering if, in some corner of the wilderness, it might still be moving closer. The camp felt cursed. Even the daylight seemed pale, drained of warmth, as if the sun itself recoiled from what lay inside the tent. Défago's condition worsened by the hour. His face grew hollow, his eyes sunken with a fevered light, and his voice never stopped. Sometimes murmurs, sometimes shrieks, but always circling back to the same dread refrain. My feet of fire. Faster, faster, it calls." They tried everything, wrapping him in blankets, feeding him broth, speaking calm words, but nothing anchored him. He writhed and trembled, ears straining toward the west as though a voice beckoned only for him. Punk avoided the tent altogether, muttering prayers under his breath. Hank sat nearby, grim and silent, his jaw tight. Even Dr. Cathcart, who had begun with talk of delusions and mental contagion, now puffed his pipe furiously, avoiding everyone's eyes. The professor's reason was strong, but each new outburst from Défago chipped at its armor. On the third night, it happened. Simpson was keeping watch when Défago suddenly sat bolt upright. His eyes gleamed, wild and unearthly, and his thin body quivered with unnatural energy. He pointed a trembling hand toward the tent flap. "It calls me again." "Can't you hear it? It knows my name." The wind, the wind. Oh mon Dieu, the Wendigo." His voice rose to a scream, shrill and terrible. Hank rushed forward to restrain him, but Défago leapt with a strength that seemed beyond human. For a moment he tore free, staggering toward the trees. Then Hank and Simpson caught him, dragging him back by sheer force. But the terror in his face seared itself into Simpson's mind. It wasn't the panic of a delirious man. It was the recognition of someone who had already seen too much. They bound him in his blankets after that, tying cords around him to keep him from running. He whimpered and struggled, then lay trembling, muttering of vast spaces, of speed too great for flesh to bear, of a hunger older than the trees themselves. Toward morning, a change came. His strength failed, his voice grew faint, and he seemed to collapse inward, like a fire burning itself out. When the light seeped into the tent, Défago lay still. his breathing shallow. Simpson thought him near death, but when the guide opened his eyes, what looked back was worse than fever. There was recognition there, recognition of something unspeakable and the faintest, strangest smile. "I've been so far," he whispered. "So far you cannot imagine." His voice cracked. The burning, the running, the call. He shuddered. "But it will not let me go." Then his face contorted in sudden agony. He clutched at his feet, writhing, crying out that they were on fire, that they were stretching, growing. His body jerked in spasms, the cords cutting into the blankets. His cries rose into a single long scream that pierced through the camp and echoed in the trees. And then, silence. When they looked, Défago had fallen limp. His eyes stared wide, his mouth half open. For a long moment, no one moved. Dr. Cathcart bent to him, pressed fingers to his wrist, then drew back slowly. "He's gone," he said. Simpson staggered outside, chest heaving. The forest loomed around them, endless and indifferent. Yet in that moment, the silence seemed not indifferent at all. It seemed attentive, as though listening for something more. It came at sunset. They had laid Défago's body in the tent, intending to bury him the next day. Hank sat by the fire, staring into the flames, while Punk muttered prayers and Cathcart filled his pipe with shaking hands. Simpson, restless, kept pacing, ears straining to the dark. And then, from far out across the flats, it rose. The same cry he had heard that first night with Défago. Long, mournful, filled with anguish and longing. It swelled through the trees, carried on the wind, closer than before. All four men froze. Punk dropped his hands, eyes wide with terror. Hank swore under his breath. Dr. Cathcart's pipe fell to the ground. Then, more dreadful still, a voice rang out. It was Défago's voice, weak, wavering, yet unmistakable. "Oh, my feet of fire, my burning feet of fire." The cry rose into a wail that ended in a sound not human at all, a shriek that rattled the very air. Simpson's knees buckled. Hank gripped his rifle, face ashen. Punk covered his ears and sobbed. Even Dr. Cathcart sat rigid, lips trembling, the last defenses of reason collapsing. No one spoke. The wilderness had spoken for them. The cry faded into the distance, drawn westward until only the sigh of wind in the trees remained. But the horror lingered like a taste in the mouth. For in the tent behind them, Défago's body was gone. They searched frantically, pulling back blankets, overturning packs, scouring the ground for tracks. Nothing remained, no mark of departure, no trace of struggle. Only the impression in the blankets where his form had lain, still warm. Dr. Cathcart stood very still, his face gray. "Hallucination," he whispered, as though clinging to the word like a raft. But his voice shook. Hank shook his head slowly. No hallucination takes a body with it. The night dragged like a lifetime. They dared not sleep, each man listening for the cry to return, each man fearing what dawn might reveal. When morning came, the ground outside the tent was marked. Not tracks exactly, but impressions, long and narrow, stretched too far for any human stride. They burned into the moss as though pressed by feet aflame. Simpson stared at them, his stomach twisting with dread. They led away westward into the flats, vanishing into the endless swamp. No one spoke for a long time. The wilderness around them seemed vast, eternal, and utterly hostile. At last, Hank broke the silence. "We leave. Today." No one argued. They broke camp that morning with a grim urgency. No one needed convincing. The impressions in the moss, those too long, too wide strides, pointed west into the wilderness. Like a trail they dared not follow. Défago was gone, body and soul, and the forest itself seemed to pulse with the echo of his cries. Punk packed quickly, face pale and eyes averted. He muttered prayers under his breath, hands trembling as he folded blankets. Simpson moved with a dazed efficiency, his mind circling around the horror of the night before. The cry, the voice, the vanishing. His muscles obeyed, but his thoughts spun uselessly. Dr. Cathcart insisted on order, though his voice was raw. He spoke of illness, of fever, of hallucinations brought on by cold and fatigue. But even as he rattled off his explanations, his hands shook so badly he spilled half the tobacco from his pouch, and his eyes kept straying westward. Only Hank was silent. He moved with the steady, deliberate gestures of a man who knew words would not help. His face was carved from stone, but in his eyes burned a recognition. He had seen this before, or something like it long ago. They lashed their gear into the canoe and pushed off across the black water, paddles dipping in unison. The lake stretched wide and still, holding the sky like glass. But the silence was not the silence of peace. It was the silence of a listener. For hours they traveled, muscles burning, no one speaking. Every ripple of water against the canoe, every whisper of wind in the pines, carried the memory of that unearthly cry. Simpson kept glancing over his shoulder, half expecting to see Défago stumbling after them across the shore, shrieking about his burning feet. By late afternoon, they reached the portage trail. The long grind of hauling packs and canoe over rock and root was almost welcome, a task to drown thought. Yet even there, the wilderness pressed on them. The moss seemed marked with faint impressions, long and narrow, as though some vast thing had passed by. Each time Simpson caught sight of them, his stomach clenched. That night, their last in the bush, they built no fire. They ate cold rations, hunched together in the tent, unwilling to let the glow of flame announce their presence. Punk muttered that fire drew spirits, and for once, no one argued. The darkness outside was suffocating. Once, far in the distance, a sound lifted, a cry so faint it might have been imagination. Yet all four men stiffened, listening. Simpson's heart thudded so hard he feared it would burst. The cry faded into nothing, but the terror it left behind lingered long into the night. When dawn came, pale and thin, they moved on at once. The canoe shot across the final lake, the current pulling them southward toward civilization. Each mile put more distance between them and the western flats. Yet none of them felt safe. At last, a faint column of smoke on the horizon announced a trading post. The sight stirred relief so sharp it was painful. Punk wept openly, shoulders shaking. Hank only paddled harder. The factor at the post greeted them with cheer that died quickly when he saw their faces. "Where's Défago?" he asked, looking past them for the missing guide. No one answered at first. Finally, Dr. Cathcart spoke, voice carefully steady. "He was taken ill, wandered off. We could not recover him." The man frowned, clearly unconvinced, but pressed no further. He offered food and shelter, which they accepted in weary silence. That evening, as they rested by a hearth for the first time in weeks, a trader spoke idly of an old tale. "There's stories up north," he said, "of a spirit that takes men. Wendigo, they call it. Feet burn the moss. Cry carries for miles. Never seen it myself, but the Cree swear by it." Simpson felt the blood drain from his face. He glanced at his uncle, who stiffened. Hank stared into the fire, jaw clenched. Punk muttered another prayer. Dr. Cathcart rose abruptly and left the room. Later, Simpson found him outside, pipe shaking in his hand. The professor spoke in a rush, as though to convince himself. "Fear, that's all. Fear and suggestion." Défago heard the tales, grew overwrought, lost his reason. His disappearance is tragic, but not supernatural. It cannot be. But his eyes betrayed him. The journey home passed without incident, yet none of them ever forgot. Simpson returned to civilization a changed man, haunted by a wilderness that seemed less indifferent than alive. He never spoke of Défago without shuddering. Punk refused to guide north again. Hank kept his silence, though sometimes, when the wind blew from the west, his gaze grew distant and his lips pressed tight. Dr. Cathcart published nothing. The man who had built his reputation on explaining away strange experiences never once wrote of what happened on the Western Flats. He returned to his lectures on psychology, but his pipe smoke hung heavier in the air, and his eyes sometimes flickered with memories he would not name. And always, for Simpson, there remained the question, was Défago lost to fever and madness, or did the wilderness itself claim him, stretching him beyond the limits of human form? No answer ever came. The Wendigo left no proof but silence, and the memory of cries that no human throat should utter. The North swallowed the story as it swallowed all things. Yet sometimes, when the wind sweeps cold through endless pines and the moss quivers under an unseen weight, travelers swear they hear a voice calling faintly, "Oh, my feet of fire, my burning feet of fire," and the forest listens.